The Nature Journal is brought to you by SAPI, the global specialized cellulose, paper and packaging company.
Well, hi from me, Neary, with this week's edition of our Nature Journal. I'm always asked about my studio. How do I go about preparing? Where is the studio? Is it soundproof? How big is the studio? And all sorts of other questions around it. Well, my studio very often is my motorcar, or sitting under a tree recording with somebody and finding out about their life story or, of course, the program that they're working on. Equally, my studio that I work on out of home, it's in the spare room. I'm surrounded by books. I have a set of curtains which take out a lot of the sound issues, and thereafter I've always got open French doors out onto the garden. This does mean that from time to time we are interrupted by anything from a flying aircraft going past to somebody hooting in the background, dogs barking, and of course birds forever twittering in the garden. Just before I started, it sounded like a buzzsaw because I had the local carpenter bees that were busy trying to gnaw their way through the roof rafters. So it is a very easy and happy studio. I've always worked on the principle that with wildlife and conservation work in particular, and of course very different if you're doing a voiceover for a particular program or voiceover for a video, but for the rest of it, it needs to be natural, and that's why we have the dove busy cooing in the background. Sometimes it's even a thunderstorm, and that makes a lot of loud crashes and bangs, but it gives it ambiance and it makes it a happy environment. Talking about a happy environment, we try and stay away from doom and gloom on our programs. There's enough doom and gloom around us in the world, and the world of biodiversity doesn't need to be a miserable place to visit. After all, it should be uplifting. So let's look at this week's program. We've got Arbor Week, Arbor Day, Arbor Month coming along, and that of course is in September of every year. Well, why do we celebrate it? I guess it's to bring a lot more information to us and us closer to trees. I'm fascinated by that as well because, in reality, man has always been close to trees, sometimes a little bit too close when you think of the trees that were used for gallows. But let's move away from that. Man has always held court under trees. Often when you were travelling, you were told to look for the large tree and turn left. You see that in Botswana, and Bain's baobabs are a particular one where information was scratched onto the tree for the next person coming along. Trees also provide shelter. They provide timber for our homes and for offices, timber for wagons, and timber for all sorts of things that the do-it-yourself person likes to do. So trees have got a tremendous amount of use to man. Ecosystem services are even a greater use for trees. Think what would happen if we didn't have the trees. We would be missing a large amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Yes, I am aware that the oceans give us more oxygen than the forests, but at the same token, our forests are extremely valuable for removing the carbon dioxide, turning it into timber, and of course, that is always a great help. Trees also provide a lot of fun for wildlife, biodiversity, and even your local friendly cat, or in my occasion, the Jack Russell that used to try and climb the tree. So everybody has a use for it. We have a dead tree in our garden, and that one's a lot of fun because, of course, there are all sorts of grubs under the bark, and that brings in all sorts of birds grubbing and chirping away happily, trying to get to the food source. One of these days, of course, that tree will have to come down, and then it will be turned into firewood. One of the items I really don't enjoy, though, about this time of the year is the sound of the buzzsaw. The saws as everybody attacks them and starts to attack their trees. Often, unfortunately, this is due to a lot of bad planning that we put in place. We tend to forget just how big trees grow and how invasive they can become as well. After all, you wouldn't plant a baobab in your local townhouse. After a couple of years, well, a couple of 100 years most likely, there'd be more baobab and no townhouse. So trees are a great source of relaxation to us as well. Think of just how beautiful trees are, not only when they're in their flower, as the Dombeia rotundifolia at the front gate is just heralding in spring at the moment, but of course trees that are deciduous and have lost their leaves in winter and other times of the year as well. They're really great and they make the most wonderful photographic opportunities. I always enjoy the baobabs, and we'll do a separate program on the baobabs, I think, because they tell us so much, not only the mythology about the baobab, but also its uses to other animals. In fact, that's another one about trees that we are so tremendously close to. It's the mythology that we have listened to and learnt all through the centuries. And no, it is not only an African item. The mythology stretches right across the world. Trees, of course, and your bird feeders. There we go, another one. What are you going to hang your bird feeder from if you don't have a tree? And of course, you can do all sorts of other fun things like taking the suet that you get from your butcher. That's the cuttings off of the circular saw, and you can rub that into the bark. That'll bring a bunch of insects, and it'll also bring a bunch of insect-eating birds. When you're choosing trees in your garden, there is always that whole debate about exotic aliens versus indigenous. But remember too that some of our indigenous trees are tremendously invasive. Not only do they breed in a prolific rate, but they also can be invasive into things like your foundations of your house, or maybe your swimming pool, or maybe lifting your paving. And hence a lot of real consideration needs to be taken. Of course, also, some of those deciduous trees that we were talking about earlier really do become a bit annoying when it comes to winter, and they dump all their leaves, which start to permeate your swimming pool, and that is not a great amount of fun. But again, we come back to those wonderful times of what the tree gives us. All those leaves that the tree is dropping, if we take them and we mulch them into our garden, suddenly the Christmas beetles will start to arrive. And that's that wonderful sound that we hear every year as it gets to round about November, December. And of course, that is the last sort of 6 months or so of that beetle's life. Because before that, it's been a grub under the leaf litter. And there's also nothing that is as amusing as sitting back and watching the ground thrushes, for example, the olive thrushes, as they go about their business. And they seem to go under the leaf litter and then burst out of it, just like a submarine that is busy surfacing, invariably holding some unsuspecting beetle in their mouth. And of course that reduces the amount of water that you need in your garden. And in wintertime it keeps your soils a lot warmer. And your plants definitely happier. There is so much to talk about on trees, and there are so many wonderful things that we can look at. There's so many wonderful books as well about trees. The 100 bushveld trees that Meg Emmett Parker has brought out recently for folk that know where the bushveld is and want to enjoy those trees a lot more. It's the story and the history of the trees, and trees are not always that easy to identify because in many occasions the bark is very similar. Trees have also served us tremendously well when it comes to traditional healing and of course medicinals of all sorts, not only the traditional medicines, but also a lot of homeopathy and Western medicines have got componentry from our trees or items that were learnt from the trees from the indigenous folk. And that of course has benefited man over time. And that comes back, I think, to the ecosystem services that we so enjoy about our trees. So trees, yes, we will be visiting them more than once, I can assure you. But do remember that during Arbor Week or Arbor Month, or maybe make it Arbor Year, plant a tree, not necessarily the tree of the year. Plant a tree that is suitable to your habitat, to your climatic conditions, and one that will do really well in your garden. And of course, bring the birds and the butterflies and the various services that it offers back to nature. And of course, remember that the trees that you plant most likely will outlive you and me, and therefore they are a heritage that we are passing on to everybody to enjoy well into the future. And as we've said, make sure that you look after your tree as well. Keep it at the right size, keep it trimmed nicely, so at the end of the day we don't have to remove that tree at all, or we don't have to cut it back dramatically. And remember that just because a tree is not big and straight and looking like its picture in the book, doesn't make it a bad tree. Trees have got wonderful shapes and descriptions from all over the area, and that makes them all the more fun. From me, Tim Neary, have yourselves an awesome week. Chat to you again next week.
The Nature Journal supports the sustainability of our planet, its people and prosperity. Brought to you by SAPI, a leading global specialized cellulose, paper and packaging company. For more information, visit www.sapi.com. SAPI, inspired by life.